Okay, point 1 of 7. The first thing we had to deal with in our research were the churches themselves. This was one of 2 churches. The focus of our research was very narrow. It was really going back to the bishop's question, if the Japanese Canadian community were dispossessed of their churches. And we were trying to answer that question, were they dispossessed of their churches? Because nobody knew how they disappeared. In a more simple format, it started in 1999. This is the same year as the bishop's letter, and one of the members in the congregation before I ever went to seminary asked me this question. And he didn't say it in an angry sense. He wasn't upset, he wasn't challenging, he wasn't accusing. He just said, almost plaintively, I wonder what happened to our churches. So our team has been in place for 5 years, and that's the question we've been trying to answer for the bishop. Our research led us to somebody who asked that same question in 1953. So the question actually had been around for a long time, but maybe not a lot happening between those years. So part of this presentation is going to be the slides. The second half is going to be from Obasan and Emily in Obasan, for those of you who've read that book, The Road Warrior, one of the few people who was willing to speak up about the injustices that happened during the Second World War. And Joy and Lynn are going to read those alternatively.
This seems worse than the racial discrimination of government by wartime orders and council. This seems like virulent, institutional, provincial racism by our bishop and his executive council, hiding behind closed doors. In the early 50s, in front of Bishop Gower and Treasurer Matheson, Reverend Timothy Nakayama asked what had happened to our 2 Japanese Canadian churches. He was given a one-word answer: relinquished. Gower and Matheson had complete knowledge of all that had transpired, including the disappearance of our funds, but they would be no more forthright than relinquished. This was the beginning of a high-level pattern of being dismissive, less than forthright. This has continued for over 50 years to this very day. We are only now discovering the extent of their silence, of their sin of omission.
For our journey of justice, if you take nothing away tonight, we'd like you to take away 3 words. They all begin with R, and we would ask that you discern what those words are during this presentation. The 3 R words and a date. A single date, which I will give to you, April the 1st, 1949. So just 4 things, and I think if you get those 4, you will understand this story with all of its complexity. Even though it happened over 70 years ago, it's really as simple as 3 R's and April the 1st, 1949. But first, we're going to go away from the churches, because for many years, the misunderstanding about what happened to the churches was probably caused by this slide. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details except the bottom right-hand corner. We call it the black hole. And that's how many properties were sold by the federal government, not by the churches, sold legally by our federal government. Properties owned on the left-hand column in Vancouver, 471 of those. One of those was Joy's father's home, the home that she grew up in. The middle column is rural areas, could be Prince Rupert, Vancouver Island, could be Cumberland. So these are the people outside of the Lower Mainland. And then the final one, the 572, were farms in the Fraser Valley. 1,421 properties that were sold forcibly. If you go through land registry, you can see that the owner on sale was not the owner, it was the government of Canada. Now, what often happens with this project, and even as a team we have to watch ourselves, is we want to go there. Because there's so many destroyed lives on that one slide, 1,421 properties, 22,000 people that were exiled. But that's not the story that we're here to tell tonight. The story we're here to tell tonight is about just 2 churches and 3 properties and what happened to them, not in 1942, 1943, but what happened after the war, 1945 and 1949. How bad was it in Canada? Just to finish on this thought, compared to the United States. We often ended up spending a lot of time on this, and we don't have time tonight, but we thought we'd leave you with one quote from the Washington Post from 1945. And in the Washington Post, in this editorial, they compared the experience of the Japanese Canadians with the Japanese Americans, and I'll let you read it for yourself. We attended an EAM conference several years ago, and we started comparing experiences. And, you know, on both sides of the border, they felt really hard done by. But the feeling was the fact that they never lost their properties in the United States. They were never dispossessed of their houses or of their churches. Whereas both of those happened in this country, and people were exiled until the date I gave you was April 1st, 1949. Nobody could come back to Vancouver until April 1st, 1949. During the Pacific War in the United States, they were already coming back in January of 1945. And this was written 6 months after that. So that's why they looked up north and they did not understand. Why can't the Japanese Canadians go back to their homes? The war threat is over. So we have one reading, and it's a Joy Kogawa reading from Obasan.
This is Anne speaking. The power of government, Nomi. Power. See how palpable it is? They took away the land, the stores, the businesses, the boats, the houses, everything. Broke up our families, told us who we could see, where we could live, what we could do, what time we could leave our houses, censored our letters, exiled us for no crime. They took our lives. Now the rest of the words will be in Anne Temley's words, but they're written by Greg. And I'm so glad that Greg was able to bring Anne Temley back to life, to have some more things to say to us than the very Nova side. Here's Anne Temley. Go ahead.
So we're here tonight about the churches, and this slide is about the churches. When we showed it to Lynn the first time, she says, Greg, that slide is far too busy, you can't show that. And she's absolutely right. But I did tell her I would not go through all the details. But the previous slide was about 1,421 properties that were sold by our provincial and federal governments. This slide is about the 3 properties that were sold by the Diocese of New Westminster in 1945 and 1949. And we really just wanted to point out 3 things. How did we get rid of the if? Bishop Michael said to Holy Cross, if we could figure it out. At the same time, he wrote the primate. And you can see from those notes on the left there, Michael Piers had a search done in the local archives, still no answers. It was still if only we knew. We don't know. But really, it was Michael who gave us the breakthrough, those 3 red words at the bottom. He suggested, why don't you go to land registry? That hadn't been done before. It's an expensive proposition. We were given a grant of $3,000. We spent half of that on doing land registry searches. And that was the breakthrough. Once we did that, we found out there was 3 properties, not 2. And we found out when they were sold, who they were sold to, how much they were sold from. And the thing that surprised us maybe more than anything else is who originally owned the churches, who originally purchased the churches. The churches were all purchased by Toronto, by the MSCC. And those of you that are involved in the First Nations know that committee very well, and they'll probably be talking about that in the second hour. It was the MSCC who purchased one of them in 1911 and the other one in the 1920s. So what we discovered through the land registry process is that they purchased it, and then it was transferred to the diocese in 1938 and 1941 for $1. So it was just a transfer from one jurisdiction to another. So we thought that was an important thing for us to understand. What was the flow of the property? Did the Japanese own it? Did Toronto own it? Or did, in fact, the diocese own it? The diocese owned it at the beginning of the Second World War in Japan. So this was our big breakthrough. We finally knew where the properties were, we knew who owned them, and we knew who sold them, and we knew how much money they got for them. And once we had that breakthrough, then we finally started to say, okay, now we're getting somewhere. Now we can maybe take away that if, but we couldn't take away the if yet because we still didn't know what happened to the money. But at least we knew what happened to the properties. Before they were owned by the Diocese of New Westminster, the Japanese Canadian community came to General Synod in 1937 in Ottawa. So the priest in charge of all the Japanese missions, along with the Metropolitan at that time, Archbishop Adams, they came and they made a presentation about this brand new church. The picture you saw right at the beginning, the church that was built in 1935 and was opened on Easter of 1935. 2 years later there were General Synod, and you can read at the bottom what went into the General Synod minutes. You can find that there today. And if you read those words, can't you feel the pride that the Japanese Canadian community felt in having built their own church? The funds for that didn't come from Toronto. The funds for that didn't come from Vancouver. They raised that money themselves, and they built it themselves. And don't those words reflect that feeling of pride of community in a major accomplishment with an Easter opening? So that's a little bit long-winded. I promise not to spend that much time on all 7 sections, but we thought this one laid the base and moved us a long way down the road in terms of answering the question, were they dispossessed of their churches? Yes, they were, but we still don't know what the intentions were in selling those churches. They may be nominal.